Olympic Village is your classic Vancouver neighborhood. Seawall? Check. Outdoor athletic store? Check. Big boxy glass buildings? Check. And crazy expensive housing? Oh, you better believe that's a big check. Renting an Olympic Village is not cheap. For example, a 2-bedroom apartment in that building behind me will cost you $4,200 a month. A 2-bedroom in this building, $5,000 a month. A 2-bedroom unit in this building rents for $4,500 a month. And just across the street, a 2-bedroom unit in that building rents for $1,900. How's that possible? Who's behind this? And could that be the subject of this video? So how is this building so affordable? Well, it's really quite simple. It doesn't make money. Let me elaborate. This building is owned by the Athletes Village Housing Co-op, a non-profit cooperative. Like the name suggests, the co-op isn't trying to make a profit from this building, so it sets rents that only cover the building's operating costs. Things like heat, water, electricity, taxes, mortgage payments, and maintenance. The building next door is a condo, and that 2-bedroom unit is owned by an individual or corporation who very much wants to make some money from their housing, so they can rent it out for, well, really whatever price they can get. Any money they make on top of their own operating costs is profit they can pocket for themselves. Sorry, I just explained to you how landlords work. The condo is an example of market housing. The price is set by the highest bidder. The Athletes Village Co-op is an example of non-market housing. The rent is set by just how much it costs to provide the housing. Why does housing like this exist? Well, it's because many people and organizations recognize that housing is, a need. And so they choose to provide housing without trying to make a profit. In some cases, there are charities such as churches and YMCAs who decide to build housing as part of their larger mission. There are nonprofit organizations specifically for housing who often own multiple properties and rent them out like a regular landlord. There are nonprofit co-ops where a group of people collectively own and manage a building and rent it to themselves. Then there's housing that's provided by the government through agencies like BC Housing. And within these categories, there are all kinds of specializations, such as housing for seniors, single moms, refugees, and even Korean seniors. Well, I guess I know my retirement plans. Now, is it always affordable housing? Well, that part's a bit more complicated. Cutting out profits can certainly make rents a bit cheaper, but at the end of the day, it still costs a lot of money to build and operate any building. Some non-market housing does receive subsidies to make its rents really affordable, but without those subsidies, non-market housing rents start out pretty comparable to market rents. Take, for example, Hannelore Housing. It's a new non-market housing development by the Oakridge Lutheran Church. It didn't receive major subsidies, so it charges $2,400 for a 2-bedroom, which is, not exactly cheap. But what can make Hannelore Housing more affordable is time. Hannelore Housing is in an up-and-coming neighborhood called Oakridge. In a decade or so, this will likely be a major city center, where art transcends museums, music travels freely, style comes naturally, beauty is all around, and dance is part of life. Wow. Anyways, a regular landlord here would be foolish not to hike up their rents, but Hannelore Housing would keep their rents more or less the same, and over time, that would make its rents relatively affordable. That's why the Athletes Village Co-op seems so affordable now. $1,900 for a 2-bedroom was actually pretty typical for Olympic Village back when it was built in 2010. But today, the co-op is still charging more or less the same amount, while its neighbors have hiked up rents year after year. But there's one more thing that happens with even more time. You see, Athletes Village Co-op and Hannelore Housing took out bank loans to construct their buildings, so much of the rent you pay here goes towards paying off those loans. So what happens when they finish paying their loans? Well, the housing becomes cheap, like really cheap. That's been the case for this co-op from the 1980s, where rents for a 2-bedroom are only $1,000 a month, and the reason why is because it's fully paid off its loans. And that is why many believe non-market housing could be an answer to the housing crisis. Rents all over the province are skyrocketing, and in Vancouver, they're up 23% from last year. Like, people are renting dens and solariums for about $1,000. For those who are trying to rent in this market, non-market housing promises a home at a stable price right now and an affordable price in the long term. But hold on, are we really making housing affordable for everyone here? Or just the people who are lucky enough to get into non-market housing? If you look at Athletes Village Co-op and pretty much any other non-market apartment in this city, there are wait lists. It's really difficult to get in. And it makes sense. It's cheaper than market housing. So this initially made me feel pretty uneasy about non-market housing. It's great for the people who can get in, but what about everyone else? Could it ever be a solution to the broader housing crisis? Well, it turns out, actually, yes. Let's say you build a lot of non-market housing, like thousands of units, no, tens of thousands of units, no, hundreds of thousands of units all over the city. You build and build and build until non-market housing is a huge player in the housing market. There are no wait lists, no lineups, no shortages. If you want to live in non-market housing, you can. Well, then you might end up with something like Vienna. In Vienna, 60% of the population lives in non-market housing, regardless of their income, and that has created an interesting effect on the larger housing market. When there is an abundance of non-market housing, private landlords have to compete with non-market housing for the same tenants. They can't afford to inflate rents because people will just apply for the non-market housing next door, where rents can be as low as €251 a month. This is known as an integrated or unitary housing market, where non-market housing is so ubiquitous that it actually keeps rents in the private sector from increasing too quickly. In fact, you can measure this effect in places that have lost non-market housing. In Amsterdam, the share of non-market housing has been steadily declining since the 2000s, and with less non-market housing to stabilize the market, rents have rapidly increased. I think that's the ultimate potential of non-market housing, why it's very much a solution to the broader housing crisis. Because when we build enough of it, it actually stabilizes rents in the overall housing market. But that is definitely not the case here. In Canada, non-market housing makes up just about 5% of the housing in our country, and at those rates, it has little to no influence on the wider housing market. So how do we change that? How do we build more non-market housing? Well, it helps to understand how non-market housing is built. Let's say you want to build non-market housing. What you first need is land. Some nonprofits like churches already have land, and sometimes the government can offer you public land for free or very cheap. But if those options aren't available, well, that's no reason to worry. Because at the end of the day, all you really need to build non-market housing is a positive, can-do attitude and money. You need money. Even if you own your own land, you still need to build something on it. And construction costs aren't cheap. So where does that money come from? Well, like I mentioned, in many cases, that money comes from a loan. Athletes Village Co-op and Hannelore Housing were able to get loans from Vancity Credit Union to construct their buildings. In other cases, the government can actually require housing developers to pay for it. For example, at this location, the local government negotiated with the developer to build some non-market housing in exchange for the right to build more density on their land. The result? 233 market condos that subsidize 30 units of non-market housing that's run by a charity called 221A. But more often than not, funding for non-market housing is pretty complicated. For example, if you look at the funding summary for this nonprofit apartment in Cole Harbour, you'll see that it took a mix of 4 different grants, selling life leases for some tenants, personal donations, money from foundations, money from fundraising events, and a bank loan. Oh, and they also got the land for $10. If you can't tell already, raising all that money from all those different sources takes a lot of work. And it's really impressive that someone pulled it off. But that is not the process for how you build a lot of non-market housing. So what many have rightfully concluded is that creating more non-market housing will ultimately require more government funding. And the thing is, until very recently, our federal government basically stopped funding this sort of housing. If you look at a graph of new non-market housing units funded by Ottawa over the years, you can see that there is a 2-decade period where almost no new non-market housing was funded at all. Why we stopped investing in non-market housing is a very complex story for another time, but what's clear is that here in Canada, we've kind of assumed that the private market can meet our housing needs, that for-profit developers will compete with each other to offer us housing at the best price, without much government assistance. And before we assess non-market housing as a solution, I think it's pretty important that we understand that private market first, and why it's not really working out. Private markets are pretty good at providing consumer goods like computers and t-shirts in the sense that when people want more of these items, the companies just make more. It would be wonderful if housing worked that way, but it almost never does. When there is demand for more housing, creating more of it is a complicated process. There are zoning bylaws in most cities that place heavy restrictions on how much housing can be built, and any changes to those rules bring out protests from local residents who are concerned about new buildings casting shadows, blocking views, or changing the character of their neighborhood. For example, in Kitsilano, a 5-story development that included non-market housing ended up being so controversial that it took 3 days of public hearings. One resident who opposed the building described it as dropping the ghetto on Kitsilano. All that fuss was over a 5-story building, not the Burj Khalifa. And it really goes to show, building more housing supply is very difficult. As a result, there is a scarcity of housing today. Vacancy rates across BC hover around 1.5%. And at those rates, landlords can basically name their price. And recently, this has produced a concerning trend. Investors such as pension funds, REITs, and residual income bros have aggressively entered the housing market. And in many cases, these investors don't buy these properties to build new housing, they buy them to take advantage of a low vacancy rate and raise rents. I think this CEO of a real estate investment firm said it best. We think there is a definite shortage of housing in Canada, and the good news for investors is that there is no easy solution in sight. He actually said that. When viewed this way, our housing crisis starts to look more like a feature of the private housing market, not a bug. So, is non-market housing the fix to all this? Well, yes and no. Many would argue that what we actually need to do is to fix the rules and barriers that are creating this housing shortage. And I think that's totally fair. In North America, we make it really difficult to build any housing, period. And even if we decide to build a lot of non-market housing, it will still run into those same barriers. Non-market housing still casts shadows, blocks views, and changes the character of the neighborhood. I think first and foremost, we need to change these rules and make it easier to build housing in general. But on top of that, evidence suggests that it isn't really a good idea to only focus on non-market housing to fix a housing crisis. Because if you only focus on non-market housing, you might end up with Hong Kong. The government here provides 46% of its population with non-market housing, but severely limits development in the private sector. Because of that, private sector rents in Hong Kong are some of the highest in the world, and people wait 6 years on average to get into non-market housing. Non-market housing is not a silver bullet solution that we can pursue while ignoring the rest of the housing market. It's all interconnected. If there's a shortage of housing in the private market, it will only place more pressures on non-market housing. But with all that being said, I ultimately think that non-market housing is still a critical part of fixing our housing crisis. I think to some extent, building housing supply is always going to have constraints. It isn't as simple as printing t-shirts and making computers. It will often be fundamentally at odds with other priorities we hold in our cities. Yes, some kind of trivial ones like protecting views, but also more understandable priorities like protecting wetlands or preventing suburban sprawl. And besides, there are other limits to housing supply that are frankly outside of our control. In Metro Vancouver, our land is limited by mountains and water on every side. That will always create the potential for housing to be scarce, and for people to exploit that scarcity by making housing as expensive as possible. Given that reality, I think we should be treating non-market housing as an important counterbalance, something that limits people's ability to exploit a housing shortage in 2 key ways: adding more supply and setting rents that help to stabilize the overall housing market, sending a reminder to all of us that housing is ultimately for people, not profits. Okay, so I'm here to put my life savings of, several $1,000s into my Vancity checking account. Because, like I've hinted throughout this video, Vancity and the Vancity Community Foundation actually play a pretty important role in helping non-market housing developments get off the ground. Together, they created the Affordable Housing Accelerator Fund to help organizations get through the pre-construction process of non-market housing. Setting out to build non-market housing can be daunting. Before you finance your building, you need to prepare designs, create cost estimates, and have municipal approvals in place, and that all costs money. This is where the Vancity Affordable Housing Accelerator Fund comes in. It provides grants, expert advice, and low-interest loans so that nonprofit organizations have the resources they need to create a strong case for their developments. To date, it has helped over 4,200 units of housing get built in our province. Where you bank really matters, and every time you deposit funds into your Vancity account, you are literally helping new non-market housing projects get built in our province. Pretty neat, right?
All I see you, all I know you, all I hope for is I'll see you again before I make the